Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, global markets reporter at Nasdaq. Joining us for the segment, we have Scott Nations, president of Nations Indexes, to discuss Nasdaq 100 performance and trends in the Nasdaq 100 volatility index with the Nasdaq 100 at a critical technical level. Scott, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks.
Thanks so much, Jill.
Let's talk about how stocks are trading before we get into specific levels with the Nasdaq 100. It seems as if old economy names are kind of where the trend is right now.
Yeah, particularly in the case of energy. If you have very much to do with energy, then you're doing really well because of all of our fears of the fallout from what's going on in Ukraine and the fact that Russia energy supplies might be cut off. So, Jill, last week, just about every stock traded well, energy names particularly well. This morning, not so much. We see that nearly everything except for energy is having a tough time because of what Chairman Powell had to say. We knew that the Fed was on the case with inflation, and we knew inflation was too high. But, he reiterated, I think, what we really knew, yet that scared everybody. The fact that we might see some 50 basis point increases from the Federal Reserve during, say, the first half of the year, the fact that they're really worried about inflation, that just spooked everybody. And so much of the gain that we saw last week is coming out of the market.
I wonder if investors are wondering if interest rates can really be as tactical as some may think to help tamper inflation. It seems to be that there's larger forces underneath the surface between supply chain issues, and was only exacerbated by the crisis that we're seeing in Europe. Perhaps they don't think interest rate hikes are going to be enough.
I think that's a great point. We have been trained to believe that the Federal Reserve can be surgical in regards to what they do with interest rates, and if they raise a little bit, that we're going to see precisely the sort of reaction in the broad economy that we want. And we know, going back decades, that that's just not the way the world works, that the Fed sometimes has to not be surgical. They can't use a scalpel. They instead have to use a club. And that is certainly what happened, say, in the first half of the 1980s. For those of us who are a little bit older than you and are about my age, they'll remember that. And so I think you're absolutely right. The idea that the Fed can raise a little bit in this year and then everything will be fine as far as inflation is concerned, that's simply wishful thinking. And you point out that much of the problem is supply chain related, which means it's geopolitical. And that's not just what's good. I mean, that's beyond what's going on in Ukraine right now.
I would agree with you there. And I also think labor cost is something else that is being factored in. I had a number of supply chain guests on this afternoon, and that's what they were talking about. Once the supply chain gets alleviated, it's still labor cost, which is not transitory, as you and I have discussed many times. And that's really where margins get cut into. And if we want to have a competitive workforce, it's also a matter of finding people to do certain types of labor. That is part of the issue as well. But Scott, in your notes, you had mentioned that the Nasdaq 100 is at a critical technical level. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it has sold off a little bit since then. But, this morning it got up to a really important level. I'm not the world's biggest fan of technical analysis, but there are a few things that really stand out and that I do like to pay attention to. And we saw the NASDAQ doing one of those things, and that is making a series of lower highs and lower lows since it made its all-time high back in November. And so we see this series of lower highs and lower lows, and it got up to one of those one of those lower levels today, which really caused some trouble. I think that so people were worried about the Nasdaq 100 in general. And then when Chairman Powell came out and said what he had to say, I mean, it was just a wonderful excuse to sell stocks if you were anxious at all.
Right. And then also we've been talking for a number of months that so many of these names, whether the Nasdaq 100 or other indices, were just so highly valued when they didn't have the fundamental metrics to support valuations such as that. So it seems as if traders, investors were looking, for the past year to 18 months for one specific event or one specific catalyst to bring these valuations back down to earth. And perhaps they're still even a little bit more overvalued, and there might be some choppiness there. So with that in mind, anything you're seeing in VOLQ that indicates either we're over the real big choppiness, or we could see some more volatility in the longer term?
Sure. Jill, VOLQ, as you know, is the Nasdaq 100 volatility index. Futures on VOLQ trade at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange on the ticker symbol VLQ. And we know that volatility moves inversely to stock prices. So if you were long a portfolio that looked like the Nasdaq 100, one way to hedge part of that exposure would be to buy VOLQ futures. Again, they move independently, actually inversely of each other. And we have seen a fair amount of volume in VOLQ today. And that's obviously a matter of people trying to hedge some of that exposure. So being long VOLQ is one good way to hedge exposure to the Nasdaq-100. There's also the wonderful NDX option complex. So if you also wanted to hedge some exposure and get a little bit different payoff profile, you could do that by buying either puts in NDX, which tend to be pretty expensive, or to reduce the cost of that whole thing quite a bit, you could buy a put spread. You get a substantial amount of protection to the downside, but you reduce the cost substantially. And those are both ways that you could hedge some of your exposure, and we've seen a lot of volume in both of those.
All right, Scott, appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.